Hoş geldiniz. Herkese merhaba. Bugün Otomotiv ile beraber, işbirliğiyle beraber toplantımızı organize ettik. Biraz daha fazla ikinci el pazarı ile ilgili değerlendirmeler ve genel otomotiv sektöründeki trendlerle ilgili bir toplantımız olacak. Toplantımızda 2 tane sunum gerçekleşecek. İlk sunumu Aslı Hanım gerçekleştirecek. İndikata Satış Direktörü Aslı Göker son gelişmelere ait bilgiler verecek. Daha sonra da İndikata Global Direktörü Andrew Shields bizlere globalde gelişmeleri ve trendlerle ilgili olarak bilgi verecek. Tercüme imkanımız var. Zaten onu görmüşsünüzdür. Soruları da 2 sunumdan sonra en sonunda sizlerden alacağız. Buyurun Aslı Hanım. Başlayalım.
Evet, teşekkür ediyorum. Herkese merhaba. İsmim Aslı Göker. Otomotiv Türkiye'de İndikata Satış Direktörü olarak görev yapmaktayım. Otomotiv Türkiye olarak ODD ile birlikte düzenlemiş olduğumuz webinara hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugünkü webinarda İndikata Global Satış Direktörü Andy Shields ile birlikte hem Türkiye hem Avrupa ikinci el pazarı hakkında değerlendirmelerimizi paylaşacağız. İkinci el araç pazarının özellikle yakıt tipleri bazında fiyat ve satış hacimlerini, elektrikli araçların gelişimini, araçların RV değişimlerini, pazardaki arz talep değişimlerini ve yarı iletken ekipmanların 2020 yılı ve sonrasındaki durum hakkında konuşacağız. Webinara başlamadan önce ben de birkaç bilgilendirme yapmak isterim. Benim sunumumla birlikte webinar kayıt edilmeye başlanacak. Öncelikle bu bilgiyi tüm katılımcılarla paylaşmak isterim. Webinar sırasında ses ayarlarınız kapalı olacak ama söz almak isterseniz elinizi kaldırmanız yeterli olacak. Zaten Hayri Bey'in de söylediği gibi tüm sunumların sonunda bir soru cevap session'ımız olacak. Andy'nin sunumunu Türkçe olarak dinleyebilirsiniz. Bunun için ekranınızda aşağıda dil butonuna hangi dilde dinlemek istiyorsanız basmanız yeterli. O yüzden izninizle ben kendi sunumuma, Türkiye pazarı hakkındaki sunumuma başlamak isterim. Bir ekranımı paylaşayım. Ekranım gelince bana haber verirseniz memnun olurum.
Geldi aslanım.
Tamam, teşekkür ediyorum. Önce çok kısa kendimizden bahsederek başlamak istiyorum. Otomotiv Grup 1996'da Danimarka'da kurulan bir firma. Otomotiv Grup'un ana işi ikinci el araç yönetiminde, yani ikinci el araçların online remarketing dediğimiz online yeniden pazarlama ve otomotiv IT çözümleri alanlarında dünya çapında hizmet veren bir kuruluş ve bir grup. 3 ana markası var. Bir tanesi Otomotiv Marketplace. Dünya genelinde 70 binden fazla alıcıya sahip ve satıcıların ikinci el araçlarını satan online araç açık arttırma platformu. İkinci markamız Otomotiv Solutions, OEM'ler, yetkili satıcılar, bankalar, araç kiralama şirketleri ve filo firmalarının büyük filolarına veya ikinci el araçlarının filo süreçlerinin yönetimi konusunda dijital çözümler sunan yazılımlara sahip. İndikata'da Otomotiv'in en yenilikçi yazılımı, yapay zeka, akıllı veri ve makine öğrenmesinden oluşmuş büyük bir iş zekası seti. Bugün hem ben hem Andy İndikata verilerini kullanarak size hem Türkiye hem de Avrupa pazarı hakkında bilgi veriyor olacak. Dünyada 24 ülkede var Otomotiv. Otomotiv Türkiye olarak da biz 2013'ten beri Türkiye'de faaliyetlerimizi sürdürüyoruz. İndikata verileriyle Türkiye pazarını anlatmaya geçmeden önce de İndikata'nın çok kısaca çalışma mantığından ben bahsetmek isterim. Türkiye'de günde 500 bin, dünyada 9 milyon verinin günlük olarak tarandığı, Türkiye'de 40 binden fazla kurumsal firmanın online mecralardaki ilanlarını tarayarak bir pazar analizi ve araç değerleme sunan bir yazılım İndikata. Online mecralar derken kastettiğim mecralar 3 ana grupta toplanıyor aslında. Bir tanesi OEM'lerin ikinci el kurumsal web siteleri. Diğer bir grup yetkili bayi ve bayi grupları ya da bağımsız bayi ve bayi grupları, C2B işi yapan firmaların web siteleri, kiralama firmalarının web siteleri, diğer üçüncü bir grupsa araç listeleme siteleri. Burada çok büyük bir veriden bahsediyoruz ama bu büyük verinin analizini yapmadan önce İndikata'nın yapay zeka ve data analitiği ile beraber bir datanın temizleme ve tekilleştirme işleminden geçmesi gerekiyor. Bu işlemden sonra biz her gün hem Türkiye'de hem de diğer 12 Avrupa ülkesinde günlük olarak ikinci el pazarına dair bir pazar analizi ve araç değerleme sunuyoruz. Bu verilerle biz size hem Türkiye hem de Avrupa pazarı ile ilgili bilgiler sunacağız şimdi. İlan adedi ve satış olarak Türkiye pazarına baktığımızda son 4 yılda Avrupa, aslında 2016'dan beri biz Türkiye pazarını tarayıp analizini yapmaya devam ediyoruz. Ama gördüğümüz şu ki son 4 yılda ikinci el araç pazarında ilan adedinde, yani kurumların, ikinci el ticareti yapan kurumların ilan adetlerinde %60'lık bir büyüme söz konusu. 2018'de yaklaşık 2,2 milyon bir ilan hareketi varken Türkiye pazarında 2021 yılında 3,5 milyonluk bir hacme ulaşmış durumda ilan adedi. Satış olarak baktığımızda ki satışta burada bir hemen parantez açmak istiyorum. Online pazarda ilandan tamamen kaldırılan ve bir daha geri yüklenmeyen kurumsal araç ilanları satış kabul ediliyor. Bu minvalde baktığımızda ikinci el araç pazarında son 4 yılın ortalamasında yaklaşık 1,8 milyonluk bir satış hacmi bulunuyor. Bu da online pazarının gün geçtikçe öneminin sektörümüzde arttığını göstermekte. Deloitte'in çok kısa bir çalışmasından bir alıntı yaptım. 2021 çalışması bu. 2020'de de aynı çalışmayı yapmışlardı. Aynı soruyu sormuşlardı tüketicilere. Bir sonraki aracınızda ne tür bir motor tercih edersiniz diye tüketicilere bir soru yönelttiler. Bu çalışmayı yaptıkları örneklem grubunun verdiği cevap, bu grubun %53'ü bir sonraki araç tercihinde yine benzinli ve dizel tercih edeceklerini söylediler. %34'ü hibrit araç tercih edebileceğini söyledi. %8 elektrikli araçlar, %5 de diğer motor tercihlerini, diğer motor seçeneklerinden tercihlerini yapacaklarını ilettiler. Durum o tüketicinin aslında paylaştığı, belki ufak bir örneklem grubu ama Türkiye'yi sonuçta burada gösteriyor. Bu örneklem grubundan yola çıkarak ben bir gerçek rakamları da sizinle paylaşmak istedim. Motor hacmi bazında hem ikinci el araç pazarını sıfırla karşılaştırarak göstermek istiyorum ama önce ikinci el araç pazarından bahsedeyim. Yine son 3 yıla baktık. Son 3 yıla baktığımızda dizel motor seçimlerinin de ve satışa olan etkisini gördüğümüzde dizel seçeneğinin, dizel motor satışlarının %3 oranında payını kaybettiğini görüyoruz. İşte 2019 yılında yaklaşık toplam ikinci el araç pazarının %66,33'ü dizel araçlardan oluşuyorken 2021 yılında bu oran %64,26'ya düşmüş durumda. Benzinli araçlarda ise payın %8 olarak arttığını görüyoruz 2019'a kıyaslandığında. %31,29 olan pay benzinli araçların 2021 sonunda 33,75 yükselmiş olduğunu görüyoruz. Hibrit araçlarda ve elektrikli araçlarda tabii ki de çok daha hızlı ve çok daha büyük bir büyüme söz konusu. Belki adetler az olabilir ama oransal baktığımızda çok korkunç bir büyüme görüyoruz burada. Hibrit araç pazarı 2019'da 0,19 iken şu anda 0,80, 2021 sonunda elektrikli araçların payı da 0,02 iken 2021 sonunda 0,23'e yükselmiş durumda. Ve diğer motor seçeneğinde de bir miktar düşüş görüyoruz. %56 oranında 2,17 iken payı 0,96 2021 sonunda. Sıfır satışları ve ikinci el araçları birlikte bir görelim istedim ben. Yakıt tipi ve satışların yakıt tipi dağılımını yine 2021 sonuçlarına baktığımızda sıfır araç satışlarının %86,2'si benzinli ve dizel. İkinci el tarafında bu %98. Hibrit araçların satışı sıfır tarafta %8,8 iken ikinci el araç pazarında 0,8. Elektrikli araçların payı sıfır araç pazarında %0,5 iken ikinci el araç pazarında 0,23 ve diğer motor seçeneğinde de yine paylarını burada görebiliyorsunuz. Tabii satış hacminin haricinde bir de fiyat değişimleri nasıl oluyor bu yakıt tiplerinin? Buna birlikte bir bakalım istiyorum ben. Tüm yakıt tipleri, yani yakıt tipi ayırmadan tüm Türkiye pazarındaki yaklaşık 15 aylık geçmişe döndük. Ocak 2021'i 100 indeks olarak aldık ve ortalama perakende fiyatlarının değişimini indeks olarak burada paylaşmam gerekirse Ocak ayında 100 olan indeks Ocak 2021'de Kasım'a kadar böyle bir yumuşak bir trendde devam etmiş. Kasım ayında 115'e çıkmış indeks ve Kasım'dan sonra zaten hepimizin de yaşadığı çok ciddi bir yükselişe geçti ikinci el araç fiyatları. 164,6 sonra 195,2'yi gördü. Bugün geldiğimizde tüm yakıt tipleri bazında baktığımızda ikinci el araç pazarına indeksin 188,9 olduğunu görüyoruz. 15 aydaki ikinci el araç fiyat değişimini gösteriyor bu. Yakıt tipi bazında bakacak olursak benzinli araçlarda durum ne? Aslında Kasım'a kadar benzinli araçlar da genel pazar ortalamasının paralelinde seyretmiş. 100 ile başlayan pazar işte Kasım ayında 113,2 olmuş benzinli araçlarda. Pazar ortalaması 115 iken Mart ayına gelindiğinde pazar ortalaması 188,9 iken 189,2 olarak görüyoruz benzinli araçlardaki fiyat değişimini. Dizel araçlara baktığımızda dizelde benzinli araçlara paralel bir trend seyretmiş. Yine 100 ile başlayan indeks Kasım ayında 115,6, Mart ayında 189,1 olarak gerçekleşmiş gözüküyor dizel araçlarda. Hibrit araçlarda bir miktar dizel ve benzinli aracın altında bir fiyat değişimi görüyoruz. Ve birazcık daha volatil bir yapı görüyoruz hibrit araçlarda. Yine Ocak ayında 100 başlattığımız indeks Kasım ayında pazar 115 iken hibrit araçlarında 113 olarak gerçekleşmiş ve Mart ayında 183,9 olarak görüyoruz hibrit araçların fiyat değişimini. Elektrikli araçlar biraz daha farklı diğerlerinden. Çok daha fazla bir volatil yapı, çok iniş çıkışlar görüyoruz. Ocak ayında 100 indeksi direkt Şubat'ta 90'a iniyor ya da 106,4 indeksi 99,7'ye inebiliyor. Biraz daha böyle volatil bir yapıda. Kasım ayına baktığımızda yine 102,1 ki pazar ortalamasının oldukça altında seyrediyor elektrikli araçlar. Mart ayına gelindiğinde de 180,4 elektrikli araçlarda bir fiyat değişimi görüyoruz. Ocak 2021'den başlattığımız indekse göre. Son olarak bir de RV değişimlere değinmek istedim ben. Açıkçası ikinci el araç pazarında. Bunu yaparken de RV hesaplamasını ve RV değişimini tüm yakıt tiplerindeki 3 yaş ve 90 bin kilometre araçları sıfır satış fiyatlarıyla karşılaştırdık. Buradaki sıfır fiyatlarda OEM'lerin kurumsal web sitelerindeki anahtar teslim fiyatlarını baz alarak karşılaştırma yaptık. Burada gördüğümüz oranda benzinli ve dizelin birbirine çok yakın bir RV oranının olduğunu, hibrit araçlarda biraz daha bu oranın diğer pazar ortalamasına özellikle benzinli ve dizelin üstünde bir RV gelişimini, o gelişimi gösterdiğini gösteriyor. Yine Ocak 2021'de başlattık bu trendi. Yine 15 aylık bir değişim. Elektrikli araçlarda da bir miktar RV oranının Ocak ayıyla kıyaslandığında Ocak 2021 1,8 oranında bir düşüş gösterdiğini söyleyebilirim. Ben Türkiye pazarı ile ilgili çok kısa bir bilgilendirme yapmak istedim. Sebebi ise zaten biz İndikatör Türkiye olarak aylık olarak bir rapor yayınlıyoruz. Analiz raporu Türkiye ikinci el araç pazarına dair ve bunu hem ODD'nin web sitesinde hem de indikatör.com.tr'de görebiliyorsunuz bu raporları. O yüzden ben sunumumu çok kısa tuttum. Zaten orada çok detaylı verilere ulaşabilirsiniz. Umuyorum bu paylaştığım veriler de sizin için faydalı olmuştur. Ben burada sunumuma son vereceğim. Hi Andy, hope you are doing well again. First of all, thank you for being here today with us. So I just shared a brief information about Turkish used car market, but invitees are mostly curious about the European used car market. So now stage is yours, Andy.
Superb, Asli. Thank you very much indeed. Hope you can hear me clearly. Let me start by sharing my screen. And okay, and bringing up the presentation. Okay, can you see my presentation okay?
Yes, Andy.
Superb. Let me take to full screen. So, Asli, firstly, thank you very much indeed for your introduction. And yes, as you've described, what I aim to do today is give a little bit more of an insight into the European market. And specifically what I'm going to be looking at is battery electric vehicles, and to see how some of the weaknesses in the values of battery electric vehicles in 2021 have progressed as we moved into 2022, and also to look at some of the future drivers that we should consider in the value of battery electric vehicles. Obviously, let me introduce myself. My name is Andy Shields. I'm the business unit director for Indicator, which means I basically have the pleasure of looking after the Indicator business unit for the 13 countries that we operate in, as well as all the data analytics and IT piece that goes behind the business unit. What I'm going to do today is take you through several elements. Firstly, I'll tell you a little bit about Indicator, but not too much, because I believe Ashley's already done a very good introduction on that. Secondly, what I'll take you through is what's been happening with battery electric vehicle sales and residual values. And then we're going to drill into a concept that we use within Indicator, which is market day supply. It's where we track supply and demand. Once we've been through that, we're going to look at what are the things that are making supply and demand change within the market in total, and specifically within battery electric vehicles. And following that, no presentation is complete without some form of summary. So briefly, a little bit about Indicator. As Ashley, I think, has already said, we're part of the Autoroller Group, where we have 3 business units: the Marketplace division, which is responsible for electronic auctions; our Solutions division, which is responsible for bespoke IT software; and the Indicator division, which is where we look at data analytics, used car pricing, used car movements, as well as a range of consultancy services for car manufacturers, leasing companies, etc. In terms of the underlying piece within Indicator, what we do across the whole of Europe is we capture data on 9 million vehicles every single day. And we take that information in from those adverts coming from franchise dealer websites, classified websites, OEM websites, and we run that data through a range of AI and data analytics. And just to give you an example of the sort of AI that we do, to recognize the vehicle, we can identify the model year of the vehicle by the shape and positioning of fog lights on the pictures associated with the advert. That's the sort of granularity of detail that we go into. Once we've analyzed all that information, we then serve up to our customers a range of pricing and market analysis through a range of different tools. And some of that analysis you've already seen with the excellent stuff that Ashley just presented. So let's have a look in more detail about what's happening with battery electric vehicles and the total market indeed, and residual values. So this is a very similar graph to one which Ashley presented just before, specifically looking at the Turkish market. But in this graph, we're looking at the German, Spanish, French, British, Italian, and Dutch markets in total. And we're tracking the progression of pricing in the market running from January 2021 all the way through to March 2022, specifically looking here at all fuel types. And you can see a level of growth in all markets, particularly strong within the UK market. Now, when we analyze this data, we're keeping a constant basket, a constant group of vehicles all the way through this piece. So what we would naturally expect to see is an element of life cycle decay, a reduction in price over the data set that we're looking at here. So naturally, we would normally expect the price of vehicles to drop over a period of time as they get older in their life cycle, just ready to be replaced by a new model coming in. So in essence, when we look at these graphs, anything that is running above the red dotted line effectively is outperforming the market. Anything that is running below the red dotted line is underperforming the market. Thus, you can see, whilst not quite as a phenomenal growth as the Turkish market, there has been strength across all markets in Europe over the last year and a half. Now, once we start looking at petrol, we see that that strength is equally there, slightly stronger than the overall, but definitely strength within the market, same much stronger position in the UK. As we look at diesels, Again, we're seeing a large amount of strength, and that's interesting in as much as there's a lot of talk across the European mainland about diesels being unpopular vehicles, about legislation going against diesels, yet pricing remains incredibly strong. As we then move to look at hybrids, again, there is a strength. Not quite as much as there is a strength within petrols and diesels, but overall, the market has been strong. But it's only once we start looking at battery electric vehicles that we see a markedly different trend. As we look at battery electric vehicles running up to the first part of this year, of 2021, we see that actually battery electric vehicles on the whole have underperformed compared to where we would expect them to be in terms of the market. In other words, prices have been dropping. They've been dropping faster than we would expect them, and actually dropping very much significantly faster than we see with petrol and diesel vehicles where there's been a growth. Yes, in the UK market, there's been some element of growth, but that would compare with the 9, 10, 11% growth that we would have seen on battery electric, on petrol vehicles from the UK market. What's then interesting is to look at how that position has begun to reverse, and we're seeing a growth position return to the battery electric market. A little bit of stabilization just at the end. So the question is, what's causing that? And in terms of looking at what's causing that, that's where we default to. We look at our market day supply number. This is a way that we can track supply and demand in total across the market. Now, let me explain in a little bit more detail how this analysis works. MDS is a measure of the marketability or attractiveness of a vehicle. If we look at volume growth, and there has been in the battery electric sector huge volume growth in both new car and in used car, that doesn't necessarily measure the demand. The key in terms of understanding the market is to understand the supply and demand relationship. Because at the end of the day, if there is lots of cars being forced onto the used car market, eventually they will be sold. And therefore, that's a case of a supply push making the market increase in size rather than a demand pull. So how do we look at that in more detail? Well, let's take this example. For every vehicle that we analyze, we will look at the number of cars that are in the market. So this may be a Ford Focus 1.6 TDI estate of a particular age, of a particular mileage, of a particular trim, body type, etc. So we would look in the market and we'd say, well, at the moment for sale in the market, there are 8 of these vehicles. The next thing we would do is we would then look for how many of those vehicles have sold in the last 45 days. And in this example, what we have is 8 cars sold. So 8 cars sold in 45 days with a stock currently of 8 cars basically says that actually at the current sales rate of 8 cars, it will take 45 days to clear the stock that is there. So our market day supply is 45 days. But if we then look at another situation where the sales rate has dropped, it's dropped by half. Only 4 vehicles have been sold. In this situation, it would now take 90 days to clear the stock of 8 cars that are there. So our market day supply is now a figure of 90. There is more supply of cars than there is demand. The market day supply goes up. And then finally, if I look at this scenario, where effectively we're seeing that there are only 2 cars sold in the last 45 days against a stock of 8 cars, well, in this situation, it's going to take 180 days for that amount of stock to get cleared at the current sales rate. So the market day supply goes up to 180. Now, when we're working with dealers at purchasing of vehicles and recommending what stock they should be buying, we use a simple traffic light system. Anything that is a market day supply below 60 is actually fast moving stock. It's stock that you can make good profits out of, and you can get a good stock turn out of. Between 60 and 120 days, it's average stock. It may cause some issues, but what you should do is look to buy that car at the right price, and you should be okay with it. But once you start moving into any stock that's over 120 days market day supply, that's a real aging risk. That should be a car that you avoid to buy as a dealer, and if you're a seller of cars, can be a significant problem. That's fine looking at it from a dealer's point of view, but equally what I want to give you is an example of how market day supply affects pricing and affects the remarketing of vehicles. So here I've got the example of a German leasing company, a customer that we were looking to grow and have grown subsequently business with. But the way that they were selling cars was very fragmented. They had many, many different auction companies who they were dealing with. They had no clear strategy in terms of where they were setting the prices for the auction, the reserve pricing in the auctions. So we came in and did our consultancy piece with them. And what we did was we reviewed 12-month sales of all the other providers. And this assessment looked to correlate the conversion rate and market day supply and sales rate overall. And these are the results. So I've got a graph here. Along the bottom, I have market day supply. To the right, I have high market day supply. These are slow moving vehicles. To the left, I have low market day supply. These are faster moving vehicles. These are the good vehicles. Along the index, along the axis here, we're looking at the sale price relative to Indicator's max purchase and Indicator's trade price overall. And what we see, oops, sorry, wrong way. What we see is actually there is a clear correlation between the market day supply and the price that's being achieved on these vehicles relative to our index. Faster moving cars getting a much better price than slower moving cars in total. Another sign of how market day supply affects pricing. Now, we also analysed this leasing company's reserves that they were setting. And interestingly, they were doing a completely wrong job on what they were doing. They weren't looking at the data. They were using gut feel, instinct, belief of where they were setting prices. And ironically, they were setting higher reserve prices on the poor cars and lower reserve prices on the better cars. So what did that do? Well, that also meant that when they were running their auctions, they got actually a very good conversion rate in the auction, selling 84% of the cars presented in the auction on the faster moving cars. But on the slower moving cars, because they weren't attractive, and also because they had put their prices up in terms of reserve prices, they also got much lower conversion rate. So again, another sign of how market day supply really does show the attractiveness and the future sale price of a vehicle and your ability to sell a vehicle at any one particular point in time. So let's go back now to the analysis that we did before, where we saw the pricing of petrol vehicles getting stronger and stronger and stronger, but the pricing of battery electric vehicles starting off quite low and dropping, and then making a recovery. So what we have here is an analysis of market day supply, and we're looking at the different fuel types. Initially, I'm looking at petrol in terms of the market day supply, running from March 2021 through to March 2022. And we're analysing the key European markets in total. So what we see on petrol vehicles is, on the whole, petrol vehicles, once we aggregate them all together, we're seeing a below 60 market day supply. And because we've got this below 60 market day supply, that is why we are seeing strong demand, or demand outstripping the supply of the vehicles, and we're seeing strong pricing that goes with that. Now, what happens if we start looking at battery electric vehicles? Well, we see battery electric vehicles being significantly worse than petrol vehicles. Much more supply relative to the demand that's there, and up in the high levels overall in terms of market day supply. But as the year then progressed, what do we see? Well, we see that change happen, and we see that battery electric vehicles suddenly become much better balanced in their supply and demand ratio than they were, and coming alongside petrol vehicles. So when we look at the analysis that we showed before, here where the supply demand ratio comes into a more equilibrium, a better position, what we then see is that also correlates with the growth in pricing on battery electric vehicles relative to the early decays that we saw. Again, what we're seeing here is market day supply being a really good indicator to understand the dynamics of what's happening in the market in total. But it's one thing to talk about this is what's happened to market day supply, therefore this is what's happened to pricing. What we need to look at is, so why did the market day supply move in that direction? Why is the supply and demand ratio changing? So that's what I aim to do now over this section. So let's have a look at battery electric vehicle sales in the European Union. This is looking at number of cars registered in the EU 27. It's the number of battery electric vehicles that have been registered in total, running from 2010 all the way through to 2020. Now you can see the total number of vehicles, and then the lines represent the market share of those vehicles. Interestingly, there's been a steady growth as we moved through the years, but suddenly in 2020 we saw a big step change in the volume and the share that battery electric vehicles were taking. And whilst it had gone from a smooth progression, it then became a sudden jump up. Why was that? Well, 2020 was the first year that the European introduced what it called the CAFE regulations. And these were a set of regulations aimed at reducing the CO2 emissions of all vehicles registered in the market. Let me explain in a little bit more detail how that worked. So the overall rules work like this. Basically, the European Union said that the OEMs, the car manufacturers, needed to get their overall CO2 levels to 95 grams per kilometre, and that was under the old NEDC methodology of assessing emissions in total. The individual targets could be pooled, so the manufacturers could club together, which made a great position for companies like Tesla, because they could partner and sell their good zero CO2 emissions to companies that had relatively high CO2 emissions positions. Or Volkswagen could combine itself as a total Volkswagen group and not just look at the individual brands. There was a penalty of 95 euros. There's a lot of 95s in this, but there's a penalty of 95 euros for every gram per kilometre over the target. So a car manufacturer who is, let's say, running at 110 grams per kilometre for all their vehicles combined would be 15 grams per kilometre over their target. What would that mean? Well, that would mean that they get a 1,400 euro penalty for every single vehicle that they registered. Or put that in perspective, that would mean that an OEM with 1 million registrations across Europe would have a 1.4 billion euro fine. This is hugely penalizing. And if you take somebody like Volkswagen Group, who have 2.5 million registrations, the scale of the pain is in the 5, 6, 7 billion euro fine for 1 year if they don't get close to their targets. So the question is, how far away from their targets were the car manufacturers? Well, on this graph, you can see effectively the progression of average CO2 output from the car manufacturers. And you can see that this level, come 2019, they were averaging 122 grams per kilometre. In 2020, they needed in total to move to 95 grams. And that is the scale of the gap that the car manufacturers had. So the scale of the penalties are not just of the order that I've been talking about here, but actually potentially a lot bigger. So the things the car manufacturers had to do many things to overcome these huge penalties that were there. Now, effectively, something came to their rescue, and it was the transition support, a process whereby the European Union gave them super credits to improve their position in the early years of the CAFE rules and regulations. What did they do in that? Well, the first thing that they did was they said that for every vehicle that is under 50 grams per kilometre, actually it's going to count double. So if you register one battery electric vehicle, which has got 0 grams per kilometre, it's actually going to be counted as if you registered 2 battery electric vehicles. And in addition, we're only going to look at your best 95% of cars. Your worst vehicles won't go into the count. Again, so if you start registering battery electric vehicles with 0 grams per kilometre, if you're BMW, it means that a V8 M5 producing 350 grams per kilometre won't be included within your overall count. What did that mean in total is that basically for every battery electric vehicle that was registered, it could reduce the level of fines for a manufacturer by between 20 and 30,000 euros, in some cases up to 40,000 euros, depending on the manufacturer. That's a huge benefit. It's like a registration bonus that has just been given to the car manufacturers for every battery electric vehicle that they register. So the net effect was that the car manufacturers had a massive incentive to force the market to register battery electric vehicles and zero to low emission vehicles, i.e. low polluting hybrid vehicles as well. Now, there was a total cap for the level of super credits that the manufacturers could get. And I'll come back to that in a second. But in essence, what the manufacturers did was in 2020, as you saw, this big step up in the volume of battery electric vehicles being registered, basically was as a result of them overforcing the market, giving huge incentives to their dealers, giving huge incentives to various buyers of vehicles, the leasing companies, and very much the new subscription services that were there. They pushed a lot of vehicles onto the market in 2020. But a lot of these vehicles were on short cycles, and so over 2020 and 2021 came back onto the used car market. And that caused the oversupply, an overforce situation, and therefore caused the price issues that we saw in the market. So what's happening now? What's the impact today of the CAFE regulations going forward? Well, they're beginning to have less and less effect. Why is that? Well, firstly, the super credits that we talked about before, the fact the vehicles would count double. They counted double in 2020, but they actually count only 1.3 times in 2022. The 95% best emissions rule was only for 2020. After that, all vehicles were counting. So there's not so much of a benefit of a battery electric vehicle replacing a high emission car. And the super credits had a total cap. So most of the OEMs wanted to use the total number they had in the time that they had the best benefit, which was in 2020. Again, another incentive for forcing the market today. So the super credits now have less impact So it's got less forcing of the market as we moved into 2021 and 2022. Equally, from the manufacturer's point of view, the compliance with CAFE is less of an issue. As we look at where the manufacturers got to halfway through 2021, we can see that the majority of them were compliant. Those that weren't compliant at halfway point, actually, whilst the numbers haven't been formally released yet, but we believe most of them have actually become compliant with the CAFE regulations by the time they hit the end of 2022. Now that they are compliant, that compliance is continuing as they go forward because they've all hit their targets in total, and volumes are continuing to grow of battery electric vehicles, but now on a more natural basis. So here we see this correction in supply and demand making the change in terms of battery electric vehicles and the recovery in their pricing relative to before. But now, as we look at the market, the chip shortage is probably the biggest driver that's affecting the market in total. So it's interesting to see what does the chip shortage now have in terms of the total market and the dynamics going forward. So the chip shortage has been one of the key reasons why we've seen the prices of most new cars go up across Europe. Effectively, a shortage of the prices of used cars go up across Europe. As we've seen a shortage of new cars coming onto the market, we've seen a shortage of used cars also being generated from that, and we've seen a shortage of part exchanges, of trade-ins, of leasing company swaps, and therefore there's a massive shortage in used cars, driving the pricing up in total. It's interesting that battery electric vehicles are particularly demanding in chips. The number of chips that's needed into a battery electric vehicle these days is about twice the amount of chips that's needed into internal combustion engine. So potentially this chip shortage is going to impact battery electric vehicles far more than on internal combustion vehicles. So if there is going to be a sustained shortage of chips, then the question is going to be, will OEMs refocus back onto internal combustion engines because they have less pressure from CAFE? And the other question is, how long will the chip issue last? Let's focus on that. What we have here to understand the chip issue is a report that we've analysed from Boston Consulting Group, which is looking at the supply-demand ratio, the outlook for the semiconductor, the chips within the automotive industry in total. Now, what we're looking at here is this supply-demand ratio. It's in a way their market day supply, but market day supply of chips. Looking at the supply-demand ratio of chips versus the demand from the automotive industry, 2018, 2019, 2020, very much nicely balanced off. What we see as we go later on into 2021 and 2022 is that there is now this significant shortage of chips going forward. If we look at this from a global vehicle production level and we look at the Boston Consultants Group's forecasts, we can really see the impact of that, and we can also see how that's going to continue. So over here, we're seeing global production of automotive dropping significantly down in the first year of COVID, the lockdown. But then we didn't see any growth, not because of COVID, but because there was about 10 million vehicles that couldn't be produced because of the chip shortage. Now, Boston Consulting Group are now forecasting that as we move in to 2022, there's still going to be, from a chip position, about a 7 to 8 million shortage of vehicles, going to a 4 million shortage of vehicles in 2023, and it's only in 2024 does the supply-demand ratio come into balance. Now, it's interesting, all of these figures are pre-Ukraine, and that also is going to have a further impact on 2022, and we maybe talk about that in the Q&A session at the end. But in effect, what we're seeing here is this shortage of new car and therefore strong pricing in used cars is liable to continue not just for another few months, but actually significantly into 2022, 2023, and only become back to stabilization come 2024. So from a used car point of view across mainland Europe, what we're looking at seeing is saying that the pricing of petrol vehicles is going to effectively keep the same momentum. There are no real signs that the market is going to turn backwards. The UK market got very strong and is maybe having a little bit of a correction, but is actually still at a constant, stable position, recognizing the red dotted line that I showed you before. That's naturally what I'd expect to see. Similarly, we're seeing battery electric vehicles have had some strengths. The question is that going to continue going forward? Because historically there has been some underlying problems with battery electric vehicle values, or is that going to be now further impacted by the shortage of chips? And as a result of that, we're going to see the prices of battery electric vehicles stay relatively strong. And we're watching and looking at that with a great deal of focus. So in summary, taking you through how Indicator does its data analytics and pulls its numbers together. We've gone through and we've looked at how used car values rose in 2021, but we've also seen how it's not just about the value, it's just not about the demand and the total sales, it's actually about the ratio of supply and demand, which is one of the key drivers in pricing in the market. And that's what we aim to do with Indicator, is to give you not just the pricing, but an understanding of the supply-demand ratios that are there too. What we've looked at is how the manufacturers overforced 2020 in terms of battery electric vehicles registrations, and that now that effect is reducing away. But those are the key primary factors to the oversupply, the dropping of pricing of battery electric vehicles, and now the correction back up. Going forward, we're looking at the chip shortages being one of the key drivers. And as I mentioned before, actually, as we move into the issues related to Ukraine, again, we could see some negative pressure on new car supply, hence suggesting a future of relatively strong used car pricing and shortage of supply in that market as well. I hope that's been interesting to you. I hope that's given you some insight into a market other than the Turkish market. And if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take those questions.
Indeed, thank you so much for your presentation.
You're very welcome.
Hayri Bey, sözü size bırakabilirim ya da soru sormak isteyen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields, Aslanım. It was very productive and comprehensive presentation.
You're welcome.
İsterseniz soru cevap kısmıyla devam edebiliriz.
Any possibility to share this presentation later on with our members?
Absolutely, no problem at all.
Okay,
Very,
thank
very
you very
happy.
much.
Very happy.
Evet, soru var mı? Veya değerlendirme yapmak isteyen arkadaş buradan el kaldırabiliyor. Veya chatten yazabiliyor.
Selim Okutur söz almak istiyor. Ben sesini...
Tamam. Selim.
Merhaba. Duyuyor musunuz? Geliyor mu sesim?
Evet.
Aslanım merhaba. Çok güzeldi datanız. Sizin aylık raporlarınızda görmediğimiz detaylar vardı. Özellikle yakıt türü bazında kırılımlar. Onu aylık raporlara ilave etmeyi düşünüyor musunuz? Yoksa bu seferlik üyelerle paylaştığınız zaman göreceğiz zaten bu sunumda, değil mi?
Sunumları zaten evet paylaşacağız Hayri Beylerle. Aslında pazar raporumuzda, Türkiye raporunda yakıt tipi bazı satış hacimlerini paylaşıyoruz. Fiyat değişikliğini paylaşmamıştık. Fiyatı daha çok segment bazlı paylaşmayı uygun gördük. Daha çok aslında raporu takip eden kullanıcılarımızdan ve izleyicilerimizden bu yorum gelmişti. Olabildiğince segmentleri kırarak hatta hani SUV segmentinde kırdık. B'yi B SUV, C'yi C SUV olarak segment bazlı bir fiyat trendi paylaşmaya çalıştık. Yakıt bazlı da paylaşmaya çalışalım. Bir değerlendirelim. Çünkü
Çok sizin için zahmet olabilir. Ama ben spesifik olarak daha sonra size temasa geçerim. Bazı sorularım olacak. Teşekkür ederim.
Ne zaman isterseniz.
Tamam.
Ben
Teşekkürler.
Soru var mı başka?
Asım Bey söz istedi sanıyorum. Asım Bey sesini açtım sanıyorum ben. Asım Bey duyabiliyor musunuz? Konuşabiliyorsunuz değil mi?
Siz beni duyabiliyor musunuz?
Evet, şimdi sesiniz geldi.
Merhaba.
Merhaba Asım Bey.
Güzel sunum için teşekkür ederiz her şeyden önce sizlere.
Biz teşekkür ederiz.
Bu sorun elektrikli araçların satışını tetikleyen kafe regülasyonu birdenbire 2020 yılında çok büyük bir ivme sağlaması. Bu güzel bir görseldi. Ben de buradan güzel bilgiler aldım. Tabii takip edenlerde de sizin söylediğiniz, sunucunun söylediği cazip şartlarda kredi verilerek bu kafe regülasyonun etkisinin kalktığı, çünkü cazip kredilerin bunun önüne geçtiği şeklindeydi. Güzel. Bu da teşvik açısından önemli. Yalnız bu cazip krediyi devlet desteği midir, üretici desteği midir? Bu konuda bir açıklama yapabilir misiniz?
And would you like to answer the question?
I would if I could understand it. So if you could do a quick translation for the question, that would be great. I'm sorry, I don't have the translation in my ears.
Asım Bey sorunuzu sorabilir miyiz acaba?
Türkçe, İngilizce hangisi?
Türkçe sorabilir misiniz tekrar sorunuzu?
Tamam. Kafe regülasyon uygulaması İngiltere'de güzel bir şekilde, pozitif bir şekilde etkilemiş, özellikle elektrikli araç satışlarını. Bu elektrikli araç satışlarını daha sonra kafe regülasyonun etkisi ortadan kalkmış, çünkü kullanılan krediler daha cazip şartlarda verilmiş satın alacaklara ve bu cazip şartlarda verilen kredi devlet desteğiyle sağlanan cazip şart mıdır yoksa üretici desteğiyle mi? O konuda tam bir açıklık gelebilir mi acaba?
So as if that question is directed to me, I don't have the English translation. So if you could
Mehmet Bey,
maybe
çevirebildiniz mi acaba? Öyle mi? Onu yetişiyor mu? Yes, he can. I believe. Andy, can you hear us?
I can hear you, Asley, but I cannot hear the English version, the English translation. So if you can maybe translate that question for me, if there's a need for me to answer.
Andy'nin sesini de duyamıyorum şu an. Andy, can you please speak on the English, but
Sorry, can you?
to hear the English version of the question?
Yeah, I cannot hear that. I think I'm only hearing the people behind in the group. I'm not hearing the English translation. So if some
The question is, let me summarize the question.
Please.
Somebody is asking that if under the CAFE issue, the support is given by OEMs or the government. The sort of support given in UK.
Okay, so under the CAFE regulations, primarily it's a penalty. It's a penalty. It's a fine by the government, by the European Union, onto the car manufacturers.
If
and
you wish,
therefore
I can explain my question as in English.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Yes, sir. The question is that, according to your explanation, CAFE regulation is affected positively to increasing of the electrical vehicle sales.
Correct.
Yes, it is good. The other things that following years, CAFE effect is reduced because the attractive credit has been provided.
Mm-hmm.
My question is that the source of the credit is governmental support or the OEM production company support? Yeah.
Good question.
If you explain this, it will be more useful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So yes. So effectively, the governments across Europe and the European Union had a two-phased approach, or a two-method approach to encourage battery electric vehicle sales. On one side, they had huge penalties for the car manufacturers if they didn't register enough battery electric vehicles. But as you say quite correctly, that there are incentives for consumers, for companies to buy battery electric vehicles for themselves or for their fleets. And interestingly, we were just doing a review this morning with our Austrian team of the Austrian taxation regime, which is very similar in the way that it operates and the incentives operate in Austrian market as they are in a number of countries. So what you see in that market is, firstly, there is for every new car that's registered, there is a registration tax called the Nova tax. And that can be anywhere between €2,000 to 20, 30, 40, 50,000 euros, depending on the CO2 emissions of the vehicles. If you have a battery electric vehicle, there is no registration tax. First incentive. The second incentive is that for running the car, every year you get charged for running the vehicle that you have. Again, there are up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 10,000 a year charges for some cars with high CO2 and high power outputs. But again, with battery electric vehicles, there is no charges. Equally, if you're a company, then there are incentives, or there have been incentives for for taking vehicles into your company. And as an employee, you also got an incentive for driving a battery electric company car. So there are all these various incentives that the governments have been producing to encourage the sale of battery electric vehicles. That's good. The challenge for the industry now is, or at least the challenge for the governments today is, it's one thing when there is battery electric vehicles have a 1% share of the total market to say, I will give you an incentive, I will not charge taxation on these vehicles, but still charge huge levels of tax on the remaining 99% of vehicles. But now, as battery electric vehicles are growing and becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger proportion, what we're seeing is a number of governments realizing that actually their total income that they're going to get from these governmental the income that they're going to get from taxation of the automotive industry is going to drop and drop and drop. And so already in a number of markets, the Danish government have already made statements that over the next 5 years, they will reduce these incentives. The Dutch government has done similar. The UK government today said that it was considering moving to road charging and charging tolls on roads to make up for the lost revenue that they are getting from the lower taxation on battery electric vehicles. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic going forward to see how these taxes are changing, and also the impact of these changing taxes on the various incentives and levels of registration of battery electric vehicle compared to diesel, compared to hybrid, compared to petrol. So a really complicated scenario is being created for exactly as you say. Great question. It's a lot now about the incentives that the governments are giving and how long they last. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Andy.
Evet, başka sorusu olan?
Ahmet Bey sanıyorum bir sorusu var.
Hello everyone, this is Ahmet Bakkaloğlu speaking, supply chain manager from Renault Turkey. Thanks for the great presentation. I have a question about actually long term, Andy. So you talk about the incentives which are not attractive like last year, and now we are facing a big semiconductor supply crisis. So we know that it takes really long time to go back. I mean, conventional, let's say, engine. So what is your opinion? Do you think that this 10% will be double or next year, or in 3 years, the trend, I mean, market share of the electric vehicles in the supply chain constraint we are facing actually?
I think it's a great question. I think if you just take away and say without supply train constraint, if you look at the huge investments that the car manufacturers are making in new product, in new factory, and equally ceasing development in internal combustion engine and in diesel and transferring their factories over, there will be constantly this growth in battery electric vehicles, and we are seeing that as we go from effectively 2% to 6%, 9% now between both battery electric vehicles and ultra low emission, the plug-in hybrids, etc. We're seeing up to 30% penetration in some markets. If you take the Norwegian market, it is now 80% of their registrations are battery electric vehicles, such as the incentives there, but also we will see the manufacturers continuing to push vehicles on, and we're also seeing that the consumer is beginning to accept these vehicles in a way that maybe they didn't earlier on. Why is that? Because if you go back 5 years ago, a good range of a battery electric vehicle was 100 to 200 miles. Now, or 120 to 240 kilometers, whereas now we see ranges at 200, 300, 400 kilometers coming through. So the vehicles are becoming more acceptable. So there is also, we're seeing genuine demand coming through and a genuine growth in supply from the manufacturers. So overall, without doubt, we will see progression in terms of more and more battery electric vehicles coming in. And indeed, you see a number of countries across Europe, a number of governments across Europe have already made statements that they will ban the sale of pure pure internal combustion engine vehicles, diesels and petrol, by 2030. They must either be hybrid or battery electric vehicle. So again, you're seeing that come 2030, you will definitely see the whole of the market or the majority of the market move to being either battery electric or plug-in hybrid of some shape or form, and probably more biased towards battery electric at that point. So that growth is going to continue without doubt. I think it's the only thing that will hold that growth back is now going to be two elements. Two elements. One is going to be the continuation of the chip shortage for a period of time, will make the manufacturers move slightly away from battery electric vehicles. Two, the charging infrastructure is certainly not growing at the pace that it needs to be growing at. And I'm going to now add a third one in, which is then the Ukraine issue, where it's going to be interesting to understand how the cost of gas, which has tripled in the last few months, compared to the cost of oil, which has only gone up by 40, 50, 60% in total. And gas is a key part of the provision of electricity. And so we're going to see electric prices going up quite significantly. So we're seeing, and add to that, the lack of nickel coming out of Ukraine will also mean that battery packs are more expensive. So we're seeing a lot of negative pressure in the near term towards battery electric vehicles, which I think will hold back the speed of growth. But overall, that speed of growth, that growth is going to happen across the European mainland. It is going to, come 2030, be predominantly a battery electric vehicle, ultra low emission vehicle marketplace in terms of the new vehicles. It won't revert back to internal combustion engine in any way, shape or form.
So as far as I understood, maybe in 2 or 3 years, the speed trend will be slower because of the threats. But after 3 years, at the end of the story, the portion of electric vehicles will be dominantly in the market, as far as I understood. Am I right?
Totally, good summary.
Thank you.
Excellent summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Great. Thank you.
Any other question?
Sema Hanım da el kaldırmıştı Aslanım.
İzin verdim ona.
Merhabalar Engi, Sema ben, Sema Kıvılcım. Aslında birazcık yanıt oldu bir önceki soruda ama az önceki sunumdaki adetleri savaşın etkisi haricinde gördük. Birazcık beklenen normalleşme sürecini uzatacak mı? Buradaki beklentimiz ne, yorumumuz ne diye soracaktım. Biraz da sunumda soru cevap tarafında konuşalım dediğimiz için aslında. Teşekkür ederim.
Again, Ashley, if that's for me, if you could do paraphrase.
Okay. And actually, Sema is directly asking the effect of the Ukrainian war to the both new car and used car market, actually. Because during your presentation, you informed that maybe we can talk later on after my presentation in the Q&A session. So she is asking, what is your opinion about the Ukrainian effect on the market?
So I think there's some very immediate effects that have happened. Firstly, actually, if you take in Ukraine, there are 17 factories in the Ukraine that produce the wiring harnesses for vehicles. And all of a sudden, the supply of wiring harnesses, the electrical plumbing within a car has ceased. And that's where you see companies like BMW, Volkswagen Group immediately go into stopping their factory lines, because that's the key component that they can no longer get, and that is having a production issue for that. Now, very quickly, they're trying to find alternative supply, and we'll see that overcome. So that's an immediate issue, but will be resolved. The other areas that will have strong impact going forward, and obviously the length of the war and the length of the problems that we have will be a primary factor in that. But if you take, for example, neon, so 50% of the world's neon is produced in the Ukraine. Now, why is neon of interest? Well, 90% of that neon is then used for the production of chips and semiconductors. So already we've got a problem and a shortage of semiconductors in the market. And now one of the key components that comes out of Ukraine to produce semiconductors, neon, is in short supply. If we take nickel, which basically almost trebled in value before nickel, there was then suspended from a lot of trading. Nickel is one of the key components actually in a lithium ion battery. Whilst it's a lithium battery, you also need nickel within that battery, and that predominantly comes from both Russia and from the Ukraine. So any shortage in the supply of that is significant, and just that alone has added about €1,000 to the cost of production of a battery electric vehicle currently, just in its pricing, notwithstanding the incredible short supply that is there. So we'll see again an impact that is on primarily focused towards the battery electric vehicle arena. The other elements that are there, palladium is another key material that comes out of Ukraine. Palladium is primarily used in catalytic converters, so that will affect the production of internal combustion engine vehicles more than anything. But again, so we're seeing as a result of what's happened in Ukraine, a significant set of issues in terms of the materials needed to build cars in a marketplace that we already have shorter vehicles in total in terms of new vehicles, and hence the strength of used vehicle prices that we have. And that's why from our side, we look at the way these graphs have been going up and up and up, and we're saying that actually at this stage we are not seeing anything that is going to radically change the trajectory of that, because the supply side is very much behind demand. We do have to bear in mind that at the end of the day, if the Ukraine issue goes on for a long period of time and fuel prices are as high as they are and there is ongoing inflation, well, the economies of Europe are going to be affected, and that might affect some levels of demand as people can't afford so much, can't afford to buy a new car. But at the moment, all the pressures are primarily on the supply issues as opposed to on the demand issues, and therefore we see that the strength of prices going forward to continue.
Thank you, Andy. Başka soru var mıdır? Yok.
Yok herhalde. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz İndikata'ya, Endi'ye, Aslı Hanım, katılımcılara. Başka soru yok sanırım. Kapatabiliriz. Herkese iyi günler, sağlıklı günler.
Çok teşekkür ederim herkese katılımınızdan dolayı. Görüşmek üzere.
Çok güzel bir sunumdu. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Teşekkür
ederiz.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Thank you so much,
Andy.
Andy.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.